Kevin McCarthy's got that stupid, I mean, just like a stupid man. And he's got that stupid face. And he goes out there and he knows the right things to say. But these people are not going to take us where we need to go. This country's falling apart. It's disintegrating. And they're going out there trying to get fewer IRS auditors hired. And they're going to take that like it's some win. Oh, we got more Republicans voted in. It's just like this never-ending game, this never-ending pinball game. Anyway, so that's that. I want to move on. I want to get into this Roger Waters controversy. Pink Floyd going full Hitler, which is pretty epic. And so our featured story is about Roger Waters, founder of Pink Floyd, who performed at a concert in Berlin last week in a Hitler costume, and now they're going to throw him in jail. This is the story here. It says, quote, "The German police are investigating Roger Waters, a founder of the band Pink Floyd, who has long been critical of Israel after he performed in Berlin last week wearing a Nazi-style costume with the one he used to critique fascism in The Wall. Mr. Waters, who has made anti-Israel statements in the past that many have said cross the line into anti-Semitism, has successfully fought 2 attempts by German courts to block him from German concert venues in the past. The investigation is focused on the costume he wore during a rendition of the Pink Floyd song In the Flesh, in which a rock star imagines himself as a fascist dictator. Similar staging was featured in the 1982 movie Pink Floyd The Wall. During parts of the concert in Berlin on May 17th and 18th, Mr. Waters wore a black trench coat with a red armband, according to videos posted on social media. Flanked by men dressed in costumes that evoke Nazi stormtroopers, he shot a prop machine gun into the audience. Mr. Waters has worn similar costumes at concerts outside of Germany for years for the routine, which he has called satire. The Berlin authorities will have to determine to what extent the display of Nazi imagery is protected by artistic freedom of expression. In Germany, displaying Nazi symbolism like swastikas or SS regalia, justifying or downplaying the Holocaust, and anti-Semitic acts are illegal. According to a researcher with the Amadou Antonio Foundation in Berlin, a group that tracks neo-Nazism, he says artistic freedom of expression is not a license to incite hatred. On giant billboards at the concert, the name of Anne Frank, one of the most readily recognizable victims of the Holocaust, during which Germans killed more than 6 million Jews, was juxtaposed next to the name Shireen Abu Akleh, a Palestinian-American television correspondent who was shot by the IDF soldiers during a raid in the West Bank last year. So, in case you don't know, I don't even know that much about Pink Floyd, and I know they've been doing this forever. This is just what they do. Specifically, Roger Waters dressing up like a Nazi. They did that in a movie 40 years ago, literally 40 years ago. They do this at every one of their concerts. Now the police are investigating for a hate crime. And I can't be the only one that when I turned 18 started to think about how weird it is that this stuff is illegal. Now, you may not like it. Maybe you think it's distasteful, offensive, granted. But it is illegal. The police will arrest you. If you're in Germany and you brandish a symbol, they will throw you in jail for years. And it's like that in like 20 countries in Europe. And it's almost close to being illegal in America. I mean, it might as well be. And I used to think a lot when I was in high school, why is it that hammer and sickle isn't as bad as a swastika? Why isn't it? I mean, seriously. They say, well, the swastika is associated with the Holocaust, where Hitler killed 6 million Jews. It's like, okay, well, under the hammer and sickle, hundreds of millions have been killed. And Russia and China, so the story goes. So what's the difference? And they say, well, the Holocaust was like specifically bad, particularly bad. That doesn't really make much sense. And then you get into the Holocaust and you get into that event and you get into what went on. And you realize that it all, like, everything rests on people believing in the Holocaust. Like, all of it rests on that. Because if the Holocaust was exaggerated, then Nazism is very similar to Soviet communism. And Hitler is very much like every other leader of that time period. And if that's the case, then it doesn't necessarily disqualify somebody from political life to talk about the white race or to talk about Jewish power, because comparing them to Hitler would be as innocuous as comparing Barack Obama to Vladimir Lenin. Do you understand what I'm saying? In other words, the uniqueness and the exceptional nature of the Holocaust, that is the foundation of an entire generation, an entire civilization, which has been set against these specific topics. Like, Bernie Sanders can go out there and call himself a socialist, and it's not damaging to him for him to evoke Russia or Che Guevara or Venezuela. It's not damaging in the same way. Obama can go to Cuba and hold up the hand of Raul Castro because it's not damaging in the same way as a Hitler or some other fascist dictator, but specifically Hitler. Why? Because of the uniqueness of the Holocaust. Other genocides, other wars, other dictators, but the Holocaust was unique. And it specifically targeted Jews. And for that reason, we can talk about China, we can talk about Russia, we can talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, we can talk about Iran, but we can't talk about Israel. You could be a socialist, you could be a communist, you could talk about Stalin, you could talk about Lenin, but you can't talk about Hitler. We can have questions about the Holodomor. We can have questions about Tiananmen Square. We can have questions about many atrocities, but we can't have questions about the Holocaust. It all goes back to that. I've been saying it for years. And things like this prove it, because why else would you need to arrest somebody for wearing a costume at a concert as satire if it wasn't for the fact that that narrative must be absolutely sacrosanct for everything else to work? Why else would that be the case? We have to ban it because it's blasphemy. If anyone were to start to blaspheme the memory of the Holocaust or blaspheme the uniqueness of the Holocaust by carelessly evoking Nazi imagery, then maybe it would begin to lose its authority. That's the only reason you ban ridicule. It's the only reason. You would ban that because if people started to get the idea that we could just dress up like that and it's all funny and we could debate about it and have a conversation, in other words, if there was like a perestroika, if there was an openness about this subject, the edifice of power would come crumbling down. That's why you have to throw him in jail. That's why you have to throw Ursula Haverbeck in jail. Ursula Haverbeck is an elderly woman. She's over the age of 80, and she got sentenced to 2 years in jail for Holocaust revisionism. That's the reason you'd have to throw a rock star who's clearly doing an artistic demonstration. It's not political. It's not, well, I mean, it is actually political, but it's not, he's not a fascist, obviously. It's satire. The only reason you need to put that guy in jail next to the 80-year-old grandma and keep Nick Fuentes out of your country, out of the Schengen zone, or people like me, it's not because it's offensive. It's not because it's hateful. It's not for any reason other than it would erode the legitimacy of the regime. And if that's the case, we need to figure out, well, what's the nature of a regime that imagery is a challenge to it? Like, that would be my next question. This is a line of thinking that I had like 10 years ago, or 8 years ago, whatever, is, okay, if it's super important for the government to arrest anybody that questions the Holocaust, then what is the nature of this government? Why? Why would they need to arrest those people? Well, clearly they don't want people to be blaspheming it. Clearly, they don't want people to be blasé. They don't want people to be nonchalant about that subject. They don't want people to ridicule it. So clearly, there's something about the Holocaust that is central to the legitimacy of the state. So what's the nature of a state that the Holocaust narrative is central to it? Light bulb, Jewish. What would be the nature of a state that is so fixated and obsessed on that alone? More so even than the atrocities perpetrated against the native people. Like, you could make a 9/11 joke. It is more acceptable to make jokes about 9/11. It is more acceptable to have a conspiracy theory about 9/11, where our own people got killed, than it is to have a conspiracy theory about an atrocity that happened in another country against people from another country. Think about that. You can more easily, in America, ridicule, criticize, lampoon, question narratives about atrocities that took place here against people here than it is to do all that about a different people in a different continent. And so that privilege alone tells you something about the nature of this regime. That privilege to have your trauma, your atrocity be the one, tells you something about the nature of this government. If it was Chinese running the country, then you wouldn't be able to make jokes about the Japanese war crimes in China. If it was Kurds running the government, you wouldn't be able to make jokes about the genocide of the Kurds. If it was Armenians running the government, it would be their privilege that they would go after people that doubted the Armenian genocide. It tells you something. But it goes beyond that. It's not just exercising this privilege. It's about the fact that to even open that conversation challenges the foundations of this liberal international consensus. And so what's the nature of the liberal international consensus then? Why do they say that we can't have an authoritarian country? Why is it they say that we can't have a coherent racial identity? We can't have nationalism? Why is it they say that we can't even begin a conversation about Jewish media control? The ADL tells us, Anti-Defamation League, Jewish group, they tell us that to start that conversation is to start a snowball that will inevitably build into another Holocaust. Why do they say? Why is this the case? Because we got the Holocaust and we got all of that because Jewish people were considered alien. They were considered different because there was a country of people with racial and ethnic solidarity because it was a closed society. If people are open and tolerant of difference, then it can never happen again. If people are open and tolerant of religious and ethnic minority groups, if they were open and tolerant of international, transnational groups influencing the country, and if maybe it even favored that sort of thing, no one would ever critique it like they did in the Nazi regime. And so you start to unpack and you see the whole thing is on display here. Like, in other words, here's what I'm getting across here. Everybody thinks that the reason that we have laws like that, the reason that Germany has a law against the Nazi swastika, the reason that America has this super, super extreme cancel culture when it comes to the Jewish stuff, people think that that is the case. I don't even know why. Because it just is controversial. People think that the status quo is like this because it's offensive, because it hurts people's feelings, because it's motivated by hatred. It's hate speech. But an event like that, like Pink Floyd getting investigated by the cops, an 80-year-old woman getting thrown in jail for 2 years, these things don't happen in a country. These things don't happen in a society where everything is as most people think it seems. Those are two things that are a logical wrinkle. We have to figure out why those things are happening because it just doesn't jibe. This is supposed to be free speech. It's supposed to be the open society. It's supposed to be liberal and tolerant. So why can't we do that? Why are they going after an 80-year-old woman? Why is it just that atrocity but no other? Why is it just that costume but no other? Just that name but no other? It's a wrinkle. It's an inconsistency. It's a double standard. And the double standard shows what's really going on. It shows who's creating that standard and why. And I just don't know how you can ever look away from that. I don't know. I've been asking that question for the last 6 years, and people have told me, like, well, you shouldn't say that. You're going to get canceled. But nobody has ever given me, like, a logical reason behind all the museums and the power of the ADL and these kinds of laws being in place and this kind of cancel culture, other than the obvious, other than the painfully obvious. And you've got these shills that are deployed on Twitter that are going to try and confuse. And they say, no. The real red pill is that it's woke corporations, or the real red pill is that it's Democrats, or it's a decentralized elite. And these guys are all Jewish. So it's just nuts. It doesn't get any less crazier. And I wish it wasn't like that. I wish I could just go to bed and wake up in a country where it isn't like that. But it is. That's the nightmare we're in. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And then it's like every day you wake up in a dystopia. Every day you realize that things are the way they are because people that hate Jesus are in charge. Straight up. People wonder why these horrors go on. People wonder why the country used to be. You look at Detroit 100 years ago, they called it the Paris of the Midwest. You look at the European civilization in the 1890s, the architecture, the music, the culture, the whole thing. And you look at where we are today, and it's a nightmare. And then you realize it's because the devil is in control at this point. Now, God is in control ultimately, but God has allowed the devil to run our country through the devil's proxies, the Jews. Why are they the devil's proxies? Because they put Jesus on the cross. That's why. Because they have rejected him for 2,000 years. They have been the negative force in Europe for 2,000 years. That's why it is, and that's why that's the one thing you can't talk about, because that's the one thing that's true. In an ocean of political narratives about everything under the sun, it's the Bilderberg, it's the Trilateral Commission, it's the Illuminati, it's the Masons, it's China, it's Russia, it's the Muslim Brotherhood. In an ocean of narratives, it's the capitalists, it's the communists. It's the rich, it's the corporations, it's the academics, it's the cathedral, it's the Vatican. In an ocean of narratives like this, there's one that you can't say, and that happens to be because it's the one that's true. That's all. That's the only place you have to go. I remember a few years ago, I was doing this documentary with MTV. It turned out to be a hit piece. And I remember I was talking to them. I said, don't you find it perturbing that Amazon is banning books? Don't you think doesn't it give you pause that Amazon is banning books by Jared Taylor? I'm like, Jared Taylor went to Yale, okay? Like, the guy's a genius. The guy's a genius intellectual. He speaks Japanese. Like, he's not some skinhead punk or something. Like, he's an intellectual. And Amazon, which is the #1 proprietor of books in America, has prevented him from publishing books there. I'm like, you as a liberal don't see the problem with that? And he goes, wait a minute, so you're telling me that if I can't buy a racist book, then we don't have a free country? Oh, racist book. Oh, well, you didn't say the book was racist. And this reminds me of like North Korea. In North Korea, you can imagine a similar conversation where they're eating rabbits or something. They're eating oversized rabbits around the table. And one of them says, don't you think it's kind of weird that the government won't let us buy any books that talk about how America is good? And you can imagine the good regime slave, the good patriotic North Korean rebuts that and says, wait a minute. So you're telling me that we don't live in a free country because you can't read spy capitalist propaganda? Okay. Wait a second. You're telling me, let me get this straight. You're telling me that North Korea isn't a free country because you can't read books by the capitalist spies? You can't read propaganda by the evil West? Now, North Korea is totally red-pilled, but you understand the analogy. And it's the same thing that's going on here. So, anyway, that's just kind of a return to form. I just, it's just like this nagging problem. And when I say problem, I mean it's a nagging logical problem. Like, work that out for me. Someone, please, someone who is smarter than, all these old boomers, they think they're smarter than me. Someone who is smarter than me, work this problem out for me. Explain why they weren't involved in 9/11 and the Jack Kennedy assassination. Explain why I'm wrong about this. I can't get over it. And it's like, so it's just there. It's just like this nagging, it's there. And for me, I can't let it go. Other people, they know that to acknowledge it would ruin their career, so they very easily just put it out of sight and out of mind. But we are not doing, if you're not talking about that, you're not talking about anything. If we're not talking about that, what are we talking about? What's a substitute for the fact that the country is being run by people that hate Jesus? What's a substitute for talking about that and trying to solve that? You want to cut the taxes? Okay, right after we have Christians running the government, right after we have Christians running the society, then we could cut your taxes. Then we could do whatever it is we need to do. But right now, people have this Holocaust religion that's based around the trauma of people that don't even like Christ. So, anyway, you see this at the Dodgers game. The Dodgers are supporting this group where they're doing a lap dance on Jesus on the cross. That's God. That's God. And this is what goes on. It barely makes the news. Like, don't you think about that? And why is that permitted? We know why. We know why. If Christians were running society, they would ban that. But they're not. Quite the opposite. Okay, but that's that. I want to move on. I want to get on into the super chats. We'll see what you guys are saying. And by the way, it's all downstream from that. Like, it really is. Okay, but let's take a look at our super chats. We'll see what you guys have to say about all this. Let me know your thoughts.